Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for reaching out to me. So this is a very short video that I've made for you where I can discuss some of the concepts that we've talked about in this class, um, just so that you have a general framework of where we're at the moment. Okay, so far we've covered three modules. This week we're going on to the fourth module. So the first module was on transculturality. So this is the first concept that I will talk about today. Then the second module was on the subaltern. You may remember the author there. It was Spivak. I will also talk about that idea. And finally, last week's concept, which was transcultural communication and how it is different from intercultural communication. Although I won't be going into depth into the specifics of intercultural communication because that concept is already somewhat defined in the discussion on interculturality. Um, it is there in the background. Okay, so first let's talk about transculturality. This is module one, and the key authors here are Wolfgang Welsh and Benesaya, Faith Benesaya. Okay, so first let me just give you a general reference so that you can think about these ideas in relation to what is happening around the world. Um, because of the internal pressures that Western nations have been experiencing due to increased migratory flows and the waves of newcomers, which are related to humanitarian crises around the world, um, there's been a struggle to uh, make identity claims or assert the traditional claim to identity, culture, and language in light of the diversity that already exists within these nations without returning to uh, old policies of exclusion, displacement, and outright expulsion through forced removal that were part of the process of nation building in the 18th century. However, there are places in the world where this is indeed what is happening. So the assertion of identity, these claims to national culture and the purity of language are paired with policies aimed at displacing populations and eliminating diversity or reducing diversity in these nations. Okay, so transculturality is a concept that brings into question our traditional notions of culture. With this concept, the focus is not about discussing how practices are different in one culture as opposed to the other, or in analyzing how contact between clearly distinct cultures is possible. Instead, it is about recognizing the mechanisms at play in the interactional production, of shared meanings that is already the underlying historical reality of human mobility and interaction. It is more about recognizing that we have already been entangled um, and are now more so than ever, to an extent that prevailing notions of culture are in opposition to the reality of the world. Culture is then defined in terms of a dual process that takes place at different levels. At the global level, there is an increase in interconnectedness and shared meanings, so there is a tendency towards universality. While at the local level, these interactions create unique configurations that result from the local mix of features that are brought into play. So at the local level, there's an opposing tendency where rather than having uniform cultures, what we're seeing is that there are differences because the mix of features that comes together at the local level is different. Culture in this sense, according to this understanding, this transculturality approach, is can be seen as the space-time where sharing takes place. So this movement away from the spherical notions of culture, this comes from Welsh. So Welsh talks about the traditional definitions of culture, um, following a metaphor of separate, distinct spheres. Another metaphor that I'll be using here in this presentation, and that comes from Baker, the other author that we worked with this past week, is of containers. So cultures or languages being seen as containers. So it's a move away from that. Because these tend to be reductionist ways of thinking about culture, language, etc., in the sense that they somewhat can be considered as stereotypes. No, so think of cultures in the sense of how we generally talk about them. No, as for example here, um, India, that being a culture and identity, or First Nations, or British. And I'm giving you these examples because of these images that I've chosen to include here. It's a movement away from these ways of viewing culture, that supposes or assumes that they're separate and clearly distinct from each other, and that these descriptions of culture correspond to unique ethnic compositions, and that a sense of belonging can be derived from them. Transculturality, in a way, is a means by which we can resist the manufactured notion of the nation state and a culture that's unique to that nation state. And it's also a way that we can resist reductionist views of language as being pure. And the same applies to identity. By using this approach, we can see what lies under these traditional ways to talk about nationality, identity, language, culture. And that is that mixing, entangling has been the rule. It is not an exception. It is not something new. It's something that's been there all along. And this way we can see, for example, that the Taj Mahal, the picture on the left, is a blend already of architectural traditions that are the result of an empire that was also the result of migrations. No, so the Mughal Empire was the construction, the result of the invasions from the east, from the descendants of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. The same can be said for these cultural products that we see in the middle. No, so the cultures that we know as First Nations are also the result of thousands of years of mobility and migration. The same can be said of the symbol of British identity, no, Stonehenge, which was also the architectural or is the architectural monument that was left by the descendants of migrant Mediterranean farmers that settled in Britain at around 4000 BC. So in cultural studies, authors have developed the theory of transculturality. by defining how it is different from other approaches to cross-cultural analysis. In the case of the readings that we worked on in the first module, the concepts that we're seeing transculturality being developed against are multiculturality and interculturality. So in Welsh, we see that transculturality is the concept that he argues should displace and replace the notions of multiculturality and interculturality. And the reason is that these two ideas or these two approaches um, rely on the traditional understanding of culture as islands or separate spheres. And this, he says, is problematic because it doesn't really reflect the reality of the world. And it, these concepts, because they don't really reflect the reality of the world, are incapable of addressing the problems of coexistence and cooperation that are on the agenda at the moment. A result of diversity in Western nations. Instead, he says these concepts end up strengthening exclusionary tendencies because they, in the end, give legitimacy to ideas, the idea that cultures are indeed different and separate spheres. So from Baker, I can take another approach to this problem. So to defining transculturality, Baker explains that multiculturality and interculturality are problematic because they are formulated around the traditional containerized understanding of culture. Transculturality is different because it is about transcending boundaries. It is about connections and not about what makes us different. Muncherry, another author that's cited in Baker, argues that while interculturality looks at connections between identifiable cultures, transculturality evokes transgression or trespassing, the very idea of culture. In other words, this is an approach that focuses on how individuals or groups cut across and move through cultural borders, creating new cultural spaces. But we have to be careful here. Rather than thinking of the transcultural as a third space or as hybridity, we are warned. So transculturality is different from this notion of hybridity or third space. Third space coming from a post-colonialist author, Homi Bhabha, and hybridity coming or being proposed by another author. This one is Latin American, Nestor Garcia Canclini, in the sense that these concepts continue to refer back to traceable cultures. So when we think of the hybrid, we think of the result of mixture whereby the components can be identifiable. No? So a person of mixed background would be described as being Chinese and Mexican. But what this theory is suggesting is that these identifiers, Chinese or Mexican, are problematic in themselves because they don't really describe a reality. There's no such thing as quote unquote Chinese or quote unquote Mexican in the sense of it describing a reality. It does describe something. It describes an ideology, so that the ideology that was necessary to create this artificial notion of nations and of a culture that's unique to that nation. But in reality, there's multiple groups that coexist in what is called China or in what is called Mexico. And often these groups go unnoticed because of these stereotypes that are used to describe these cultures. No? So that's what's problematic with the idea of hybridity. And the same applies to third space in the sense that third space refers back to a location in between two clearly defined containers. Yeah, so the two containers would be two cultures, two separate cultures that are coming into contact, and that third space is the space in between where a new culture would emerge. But the problem here is that we keep going back to the idea of clearly separate and defined cultures. Yeah, so let me see if I can give you another example. So let's think of a cup of hot cocoa. So while the cup of hot cocoa may resemble one of the drinks that was common in Mesoamerica, so Middle America, Mexico, Central America, etc., the connection is so distant and diffuse that few people would call hot cocoa chocolate, so the Aztec name for the drink. That connection is so far back, it's so distant, so diffuse, that the drink itself has become something new. And while there is an origin there, that origin has been transformed through time and space in such a way that the ingredients that make up that cup of hot cocoa cannot really be traced to that ancient past. Yeah, so the Aztec drink was, for example, taken without sweetener, so it was bitter, and the infusion actually included chilies, so it's totally different. So how does this relate to what we're studying? Well, the issue that we see when diasporic groups make their identity claims is that they usually make their claim in relation to a national background. No? So I'm half this, half that. These references are usually stated in terms of national origin. No? And these national labels will definitely, invariably, fail to encompass the diversity of voices that exist in the territories that are being described. In fact, these references are often made to local experiences in places that are subject to very dynamic population changes, where there's a lot of population flow, meaning that the references actually don't describe what you would find if you were to travel to these locations currently. It's the product of nostalgia, no? And they're often idealized. So there's an author that Baker cites. Their name is Abu Rub, and on page 284, this author defines transculturality as a concept, a methodology, and a historical phenomenon. The author says that cultures are considered always relational. They've always been relational. You can't speak of them or about them as unique and different entities. They've always been the product of entanglements, exchanges. In this sense, porosity and hybridization has always been a part of the process. Borders are acknowledged only to the extent that you're talking about crossing them, but not in the sense of delimiting self-contained notions of culture. Okay, so now I'd like to move on to the concept of the subaltern. And the way I'm approaching this reading is a little more complex. So I need to talk about epistemology. So this is an approach or a philosophy or a concern um, to give you the point of reference as to how I would be approaching the discussion between Spivak and Foucault and Deleuze. So the core problem of Western philosophical thought is how we come to know the world. Okay, so how we relate to what we would call the reality around us. This concern is the study of epistemology. So ology, the study of, episte, knowledge, the study of knowledge. Episteme. The traditional approach taken, something that all Western philosophical traditions have in common, is that this problem can be schematized in terms of the relationship between the subject and experience, or the subject and the external world. Please have a look at the diagram that I've created to illustrate this. The search for knowledge begins then within the subject, and the relationship with the object takes place through experience, through the senses. No, so experiences are internalized through the sensory organs that we possess. Once internalized, they are subject to reason. These experiences are structured through language, and language gives us the framework through which we can make logical statements about these experiences. So truth is determined through the structure of language. No, it could either be through intersubjective agreement, in the sense of people agreeing that an experience is that they share an experience, that an experience is indeed common to them, and that it is reflective of the world that they share, or through empirical means, so through measurement and the use of instruments that remove the subjective element from experience. But this relationship has been problematized, so it's problematic. It has been questioned, and these questions have been formulated in terms of the validity of how we can establish truth. So, our senses can be deceiving. No? Some philosophers have posited that the colors, textures, shapes that we seem to perceive could actually be distorted. And these perceptions could also be false, because if we're assuming that we can establish the validity of a perception based on whether another subject also experienced this reality, there could be agreement at the surface level, but disagreement at what it is that we exactly understand by a trait. No, what an attribute actually, the way an attribute is actually defined. So these ways of establishing truth can be disputed. No? There's also things that we might not be seeing that, or we might not be aware of, that might be escaping our awareness, that could also be raised or be brought into discussion to question our claims of truth. So there's two basic philosophical traditions in Western thought. One is rationalism, and that involves that, or it claims that human reason is the way to access knowledge, and the other one is empiricism, that the source or the path to knowledge or truth is through experience. Post-colonial and decolonial scholars posit that this way of framing how we go about knowing about the world, so this whole thing about the split between subject and object, and how the senses are what mediates a relationship to reality, is problematic too, because this is a very unique way of thinking that places reason at in a privileged position, that is actually the cornerstone of colonialism. For post-colonial thinkers, the strategy, this is the strategy, so this way of seeing the world is the strategy that was used by European colonial powers to frame the relationship with the colonial populations. It is the foundation that laid the groundwork for empire. In what way? So let's think about this for a second. So when contact happened, the first one of the first logical steps that was taken was to identify the populations that were being encountered with nature. In doing so, they were set as the object that was the subject of European inquiry and European action, European interest. Yeah, so we have the European knowing subject with morality and reason being confronted by the natural colonial other. No? So in this way, the inhabitants of the Americas first, and then Africa, Southeast Asia, and Oceania were considered secondary. So there's a primacy of the subject that knows, and the object closer to nature is the object of knowledge. So there's a relationship of power, of subordination here. This is called the colonial hierarchy of power. So when you think about Spivak's dispute with Foucault and Deleuze, please think about it in context of this philosophical problem. What Spivak is saying is that Foucault and Deleuze are basically imposing this relationship between subject and object to every individual in the third world, and additionally that to Foucault and Deleuze, the third world basically represents the French colonies. And in doing so, they assume that the subaltern is able to think critically about the world and find a path to liberation without the need for the intervention of intellectuals, so without the need for representation. Spivak says, however, that this cannot be so because colonialism has erased any other ways of knowledge, replacing it with Western rationality. So this epistemology that we are seeing on the screen. So the subaltern cannot but see the world through this frame, which imposes a worldview and experience. The problem being here that the relationship with the world is not pure and direct, but already mediated through language. Yeah, we said that earlier. No, so for the Western knowing subject, it is language that structures how we view the world. And that is something that we share regardless of where we are from because of colonialism, because colonialism has imposed this way of viewing the world um, throughout the world. Furthermore, because they see the world through this epistemological framework, the subaltern, we are caught in a trap. We can only define our own subjectivity through what Derrida calls supplementation. This is in Spivak. The argument that all Western claims of truth are not self-contained because they are constructed through the process of deriving meaning by establishing difference. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, it means that we inevitably will define ourselves through othering. Our identity claims are made by enunciating how we're different from the other. So the first module was more about laying the groundwork for this discussion, that culture is socially constructed and that notions of culture um, as being static, separate spheres that are clearly different from one another and are tied to a territory do not apply in the late modern world, that this is no longer, or it has never been a reality, but it was the prevalent idea, or it has been the prevalent idea since the 17th and 18th century because of the need, first because of colonialism, and then later because of the need to establish this idea of the nation state. In this way, identity claims about being of any given national origin, such as Canadian or American, can be framed as acts of othering. They are statements about who belongs and who does not. They are also acts of silencing. Your a statement or my statement of who I am based on my nationality is an act of exclusion. I'm excluding not only who is different to the stereotype, but I'm also excluding the multiple voices that also live within that territory. So in patriotism, in other words, the very possibility of difference is erased by the call to unity. With Spivak, what we're seeing is that othering is an expression of a logic that cuts across Western rationality, supplementation. This is the logic upon which all of European thought after the 17th century is built. This means that all attempts at connecting with the people that constitute our communities have to consider the risk of failure because we have an Eurocentric propensity to marginalize and subordinate the other. So now moving on to transcultural communication. So transcultural communication is theorized in relation to the debate that I opened this presentation with, so transculturality, and in relation to interculturality and multiculturality, in particular intercultural studies. The idea here is that transcultural communication is about transcending boundaries and the notion of container cultures and named languages. It is about emphasizing the transnational and transcultural flows. Within this perspective, culture is not just about practices at one level, but at in many modes. So this can be text, oral, linguistic, spatial, etc. Meaning making is conceptualized or conceived as being very complex and occurring through the interplay of heterodox semiotic resources. So when we make meaning, we don't just do it conversationally through language, we also do it through images. And through sounds and through or modes of interaction. And it also takes place at different spatial levels. No? So it's physical, but as we see in the papers that we worked with this last week, it is also virtual. Furthermore, practices of communication can't be really identified, right? So they can't really be traced. So when you see, as you're seeing on the screen right now, signifiers, symbols in this conversation, it's on an online conversation, and if I'm not mistaken, it is on Facebook messaging. These symbols, while they might look like they originate in English, they cannot really be traced to the English language only. So they have become globally understandable symbols, and they're used in multiple locations by multiple communities, and therefore the true origin, where it came from when it arrived at this conversation in particular, is difficult to trace. Participants in these conversations are moving across boundaries rather than staying in a space in between languages. As this is a conversation on Facebook messaging, it takes place at multiple scales. I think this one takes place within students of a common institution locally, but they belong to different linguistic backgrounds. It also takes place at different time frames, so it can either be ephemeral, as some conversations or some exchanges on the internet are, or it could be more temporary, as interactions occur in physical space, or even permanent with members of more stable social groupings, either in the physical or the virtual world. And they can also involve forms of communication that don't really follow the structures of a conventional language. So in this particular case, you're seeing an exchange where people are talking in what looks like somewhat a mixture of two languages, but there's more, no? So these languages, neither of these languages is actually structuring the conversation. It seems like they're referring to ideas that go beyond the bounds of these languages. Okay. Okay, so the purpose of this presentation is not to be a lecture. This is just me talking about some of the concepts that we've covered in this class in a very informal manner. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to talk about any of this further. You'll find my address on the screen. Thanks.